Something shifted the moment they realized you were no longer confused. Not louder, not dramatic, not announced with trumpets, but quiet and unmistakable. The energy around you changed. The conversations changed. The looks changed. Because awareness, once seen, cannot be unseen. And when someone finally understands what is really happening beneath the surface of people's words, motives, and masks, it unsettles those who depend on them staying unaware. Have you ever noticed how calm confidence makes certain people nervous? How silence can expose more truth than arguments ever could? There is a strange tension that appears when a person stops reacting the way others expect. It is not anger that disturbs them. It is not rebellion. It is clarity. When someone can no longer be manipulated by guilt, fear, or approval, they become unpredictable to those who rely on control. And unpredictability to a manipulator feels like danger. That is when the whispers begin. That is when subtle resistance forms. Not because you attacked anyone, but because you finally see. Awareness is powerful in a way that does not need to announce itself. It does not shout. It observes. It listens. It recognizes patterns. And once you recognize patterns, illusions lose their strength. The person who once doubted themselves now pauses and asks, "Why did that comment feel calculated? Why did that compliment feel like a test? Why did that apology feel rehearsed?" Questions like these do not make you paranoid. They make you perceptive. And perception changes everything. People are comfortable when you fit the role they assign to you. The agreeable one, the quiet one. The one who always forgives instantly. The one who never questions. But what happens when that role no longer fits? What happens when you start responding with calm instead of emotion, with thought instead of impulse? It confuses them. They cannot predict you anymore. And when they cannot predict you, they cannot control the outcome. There is a reason awareness often feels lonely at first, not because you are truly alone, but because illusions tend to be social. Many environments are built on unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths. When one person stops participating in that agreement, the shift is noticeable. It can feel like tension in a room without anyone saying a word. Have you felt that before? That moment when you realize the atmosphere changed simply because you understood something you were not supposed to notice. But awareness is not about superiority. It is not about looking down on anyone. Real awareness is quiet, grounded, and steady. It does not rush to expose. It does not rush to accuse. It simply sees clearly, and clarity has a way of revealing what noise tries to hide. Those who relied on confusion can sense when confusion is gone. They may not admit it out loud, but they feel it, because when you understand their patterns, their usual strategies stop working. What truly unsettles them is not that you know something, it is that you know and remain calm. Panic feeds on reaction. Control feeds on emotion. But stillness starves both. When you stop reacting the way they expect, they are forced to confront something unfamiliar themselves, and that is the part many people try to avoid. It is easier to manage someone else's perception than to face your own reflection. So the shift you feel is real, not mystical, not imaginary, but psychological and deeply human. Awareness changes posture, tone, timing, and presence. Others notice it even if they cannot explain it. They sense that something about you is no longer accessible in the same way, and that realization creates pressure, not in you, but in them. Because the moment they recognize that you understand, they also realize that their usual influence has limits, and limits, to those who depend on control, feel like panic. What makes this moment so intense is that nothing outward may have changed, yet everything inward has. You still speak, still smile, still move through the same spaces, but your perception has sharpened. You begin to notice the pauses between words, the intentions behind gestures, the difference between sincerity and performance. It is almost like watching a familiar story and suddenly realizing you had misunderstood the characters all along. And once you see it, you cannot return to the old version of the story. Would you even want to? Many people move through life assuming everyone operates from honesty and goodwill. It is a comforting assumption, and there is nothing wrong with having a hopeful outlook. But awareness introduces balance. It teaches that kindness and caution can coexist, that empathy does not require blindness, and that understanding human nature is not negativity but wisdom. When you reach that point, your reactions change naturally. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing approval. You stop volunteering your energy where it is not valued. And that quiet shift speaks louder than any declaration ever could. Those who once benefited from your unawareness can feel that difference immediately. They may not understand why your presence feels different, but they sense it. They notice you no longer rush to fill silences. They notice you do not take bait disguised as jokes. They notice you respond to pressure with composure instead of urgency. To someone who relied on provoking you, that calm is unsettling. It removes the script they were used to following. And when the script disappears, so does their sense of control. This is where the tension often rises. Not always openly, not always dramatically, but subtly. A slight change in tone. A comment that sounds harmless yet carries an edge. A reaction that seems disproportionate to the moment. These are not random. They are signals. Signals that something in the dynamic has shifted. Because when someone realizes you understand their patterns, they also realize their usual methods no longer have the same effect. And that realization can feel threatening to them, even if you never intended to threaten anyone. It is important to understand that this reaction is not always malicious. Sometimes people panic simply because they are unfamiliar with being seen clearly. Most individuals go through life presenting versions of themselves shaped by expectation, habit, or fear. When someone looks at them with genuine perception, it can feel exposing, even if nothing is said aloud. Have you ever felt slightly nervous around someone who seemed to read the room effortlessly? Not because they judged you, but because you sensed they noticed everything. Awareness does not mean assuming the worst about others. It means recognizing what is present without denial or exaggeration. It is the ability to observe without immediately reacting, to listen without immediately agreeing, to understand without immediately trusting. That level of perception creates a kind of quiet authority. Not authority over people, but authority over yourself. And self-possession is one of the most powerful states a person can reach. The reason this state affects others so strongly is simple. When you are grounded, you cannot be easily pulled into chaos. When you are clear, confusion loses its grip. When you are steady, instability around you becomes obvious. People who depend on emotional turbulence often feel uneasy around someone who refuses to generate it. It is not that you changed the environment. It is that your presence revealed what was already there. So when you sense that subtle panic in others, understand what it really means. It means they recognize that you recognize. It means the unspoken dynamics they relied on are no longer invisible. And that awareness, calm and unannounced, quietly reshapes every interaction that follows. There comes a stage in awareness that feels almost surreal, as if you are watching the same world, but through clearer air. The patterns you once overlooked now stand out with sharp definition. You start to recognize how tone can contradict words, how praise can conceal intention, how timing can reveal motive. It is not that you became suspicious. It is that you became observant, and observation, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. Have you noticed how clarity often arrives quietly, without announcement, yet changes everything it touches? At first, this level of perception can feel isolating, not because you are separated from people, but because you are no longer entangled in the same illusions. Conversations you once found convincing may now sound rehearsed. Situations that once confused you may now appear predictable. You begin to see cause and effect where you once saw coincidence. And with that realization comes a strange calm, the kind that does not depend on circumstances. It comes from understanding. Understanding is different from assumption. Assumption guesses. Understanding observes. When you understand, you do not need to argue loudly or prove yourself constantly. You simply know what you see. And that quiet certainty carries a presence of its own. Others can feel it even when you say nothing about it. They sense that you are no longer easily swayed, no longer easily pressured, no longer easily distracted from what you perceive as true. That realization alone can shift the entire dynamic around you. Some people respond to that shift with respect. They recognize steadiness and feel safe around it. But others react differently. They may grow uneasy, not because you harmed them, but because your clarity makes it harder for them to hide behind confusion. It is not your awareness that troubles them. It is what your awareness reflects back. When someone senses they are being understood more deeply than they intended, it can feel like standing in a light they did not expect, and unexpected light can feel intense to eyes accustomed to shadow. This is where many misunderstand what is happening. They assume tension means conflict. But tension often means exposure. It means something that once operated unnoticed is now visible. Think about it. When a hidden pattern is finally recognized, does the pattern disappear immediately, or does it react first? Most of the time, it reacts. Not always aggressively, sometimes subtly, sometimes passively, but it reacts. Because recognition changes the balance. What was once concealed must now adjust to being seen. The remarkable part is that you do not need to announce what you see. Awareness is strongest when it is quiet. Loud declarations often invite unnecessary resistance, but calm understanding speaks through presence alone. Your posture, your timing, your silence, your choice of words, all begin to communicate something new. People notice you are no longer pulled into the same emotional loops. They notice you do not rush to defend yourself against every opinion. They notice you let certain remarks pass without engagement, and that restraint carries more power than reaction ever could. There is also a deeper realization that comes with this stage. You start to understand that not every reaction deserves your response. Not every opinion deserves your energy, and not every situation deserves your involvement. That discernment is not indifference. It is wisdom in motion. It is the ability to choose where your attention goes instead of letting others choose it for you. And when you reach that point, something profound happens. The noise that once surrounded you begins to lose its influence. So if you sense that subtle shift in how people behave around you, do not rush to interpret it as hostility. Sometimes it is simply recognition. They can tell you see more than before. They can tell you are no longer navigating blindly. And whether they admire it or feel unsettled by it, they know one thing for certain: you are not the same as you were when you did not yet understand. Eventually, Awareness reaches a level where it no longer feels like something you are trying to maintain. It becomes natural, like breathing or walking. You are not forcing yourself to notice patterns anymore. You simply notice. You are not reminding yourself to stay calm. You simply remain steady. And that is when the real transformation becomes visible, not because you announce it, but because your presence begins to carry a different weight. People can sense when someone is grounded within themselves. It is subtle, but unmistakable. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt that someone there was centered, even before they spoke a single word? That kind of presence does not come from status, noise, or display. It comes from alignment. Alignment between what you see, what you understand, and how you respond. When those three things match, there is no inner conflict. And when there is no inner conflict, there is a calm that cannot easily be disturbed. Others may still try to provoke, test, or analyze you, but their efforts begin to lose momentum. Not because you resist them aggressively, but because you do not feed the tension they rely on. Calmness can be disarming in a way that force never is. This is often the point where people who once underestimated you begin to reassess. They may not say it directly. In fact, they usually will not. But their behavior reveals it. Their tone becomes more careful. Their words become more measured. Their assumptions about you begin to change. Why? Because they realize you are aware of more than they thought. And when someone realizes they can no longer predict your reactions or influence your emotions easily, it creates a kind of internal pressure. Not panic in the dramatic sense, but a quiet unease that comes from uncertainty. Uncertainty is powerful. It disrupts expectations. It forces people to think instead of assume. Those who once felt comfortable placing you in a box now find that the box no longer fits. They cannot rely on old impressions. They cannot rely on old strategies. They have to face the reality of who you actually are rather than who they assumed you were. And that shift can be uncomfortable for them, especially if they benefited from misunderstanding you before. But here is the deeper truth that many overlook. This stage is not about them at all. It is about you. It is about the moment you stop measuring yourself through other people's reactions and start standing firmly in your own understanding. That is real stability, not the kind that depends on praise, agreement, or validation, but the kind that exists even in silence. When you reach that point, you realize something freeing. You do not need everyone to understand you. You only need to understand yourself. And once that realization settles in, something remarkable happens. The tension you once felt around certain people fades. Not because they changed, but because your perception of them changed. You see their reactions for what they are, responses shaped by their own fears, habits, and expectations. Instead of taking those reactions personally, you observe them with calm curiosity. You recognize patterns without absorbing them. And that ability creates a quiet strength that cannot be easily shaken. So if you sense that others are acting differently now, if you notice that subtle shift in how they look at you, speak to you, or respond to you, do not let it disturb your peace. It may simply mean they recognize what you already know. You see clearly, you understand quietly, and you stand steadily. That combination does not need to announce itself to be felt, because true awareness never demands attention. It changes the atmosphere simply by existing. There is a final stage of awareness that very few people talk about, because it is quieter than anyone expects. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not arrive with applause or recognition. It arrives like dawn, gradually, gently, until suddenly you realize the darkness you once stood in is gone. And in that moment, something inside you settles. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Have you ever noticed how true understanding often feels peaceful rather than intense? At this stage, you stop feeling the need to prove what you see. Earlier, awareness can feel urgent, almost like you want others to recognize what you have recognized. But maturity within awareness removes that urgency. You begin to understand that truth does not require an audience to remain true. Reality does not depend on agreement, and perception does not lose its accuracy just because someone else refuses to see it. That realization is liberating in a way words can barely capture. People who once expected you to react strongly may start to feel confused by your stillness. They may wonder why certain remarks no longer affect you, why certain tactics no longer work, why certain pressures no longer move you. What they are really witnessing is not distance, it is stability. You are not withdrawing from life. You are standing firmly within it. And stability has a presence that cannot be easily shaken because it is rooted in understanding rather than impulse. It is important to realize that calm awareness is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is clarity guided by balance. You still feel. You still care. You still engage. But you do so with intention instead of reaction. That difference may look subtle from the outside, yet internally it changes everything. Instead of being pulled into every emotional current around you, you choose which waters deserve your energy. Instead of absorbing every opinion, you evaluate. Instead of rushing to respond, you pause, and in that pause lies power. Some will respect that change immediately. Others may resist it, not because they dislike you, but because your growth disrupts the version of you they were comfortable with. People often prefer the familiar, even if the familiar was inaccurate. When you grow beyond their expectations, they have to adjust their understanding, and adjustment requires effort. Not everyone is ready to make that effort right away, so they may hesitate. They may watch. They may test, not to challenge you, but to understand who you have become. This is where wisdom matters most, because awareness without wisdom can become arrogance, but awareness guided by humility becomes insight. You begin to see that everyone is at a different stage of understanding, just as you once were. Instead of judging, you observe. Instead of reacting, you reflect. Instead of assuming, you discern, and that approach creates a rare kind of presence, one that feels steady rather than forceful, grounded rather than loud. When you reach this point, something quietly beautiful happens. The need to control outcomes fades. The need to win every exchange disappears. The need to be validated loses its grip. You realize that your peace was never meant to be negotiated with the outside world. It was meant to be cultivated within, and once it is cultivated, it becomes resilient. Situations may shift. People may change. Circumstances may surprise you. But that inner steadiness remains. So if you feel that calm settling into your spirit, if you notice that you are no longer easily shaken, no longer easily pressured, no longer easily distracted from what you know is right, understand what that means. It means you have crossed a threshold many never reach. Not a threshold of superiority, but a threshold of clarity. And clarity, once gained, does not need to announce itself. It simply shines through your presence, quietly revealing that you see, you understand, and you stand unshaken.